My main field is environmental science, and today we're going to be talking about a very widespread pesticide called glyphosate. Now, glyphosate is a really interesting pesticide for a number of reasons. One, it is one of the most widely used ones in the world, and two, they put it on crops which have to be genetically modified, so the pesticide will not kill the crops. It'll just kill the weeds around the crop. And as we're going to discuss later, this will pose a serious problem, because not only are we talking about a pesticide, but we're talking about genetically modified organisms to go with it. Now that sounds like something strange, genetically modified organisms. Unfortunately, these are in our food that we eat all the time, things like cornflakes and soybeans and other things. So we're going to learn about this, and we'll see the pros and cons. Now the name of the lecture is Glyphosate. It's one of the most widely used pesticides in the world. Questions arise as to its safety. Is it good, bad, or ugly? Well, we're going to talk about the latter two, because if it's good, that's debatable. So let's discuss it right now. In order to do this, I'm going to give you a lot of information about pesticides. However, I have discovered in my research that there are many articles written on it, and the majority are not too good. So what I'm going to do first is show you two little 2 or 3 minute videos, one explaining the virtues of it, and the other is not so good, telling you about the myriad and wide range of medical issues associated with it. So, without any further ado, let's get on to these little movies on glyphosate. And I know everything works this time, the sound and everything is nice, and we'll see what happens. You should be concerned though, considering that this pesticide, here we go, here is the pro.
The ingredient glyphosate. Is it harmful? How does it work? Give it a minute. Glyphosate-based products were introduced in the 70s and became popular with farmers for the wide variety of weeds they help control and their history of safe use. In fact, in addition to the US EPA, regulatory agencies in more than 160 countries have approved glyphosate-based products. Here's how it works. Glyphosate is applied to weeds. Once absorbed, it travels to the roots, where it blocks a specific enzyme found in plants, not animals or humans. Without that enzyme, the weed can't make the building blocks it needs to grow. The entire weed withers to the ground, where any remaining glyphosate is broken down in the soil into naturally occurring substances like carbon dioxide and phosphate. To further target only weeds, certain crops have been specifically modified so that glyphosate doesn't affect them. This means farmers don't have to turn over their soil as much to control weeds, which reduces emissions. It also reduces soil erosion, in some cases by as much as 90%. Precise, effective, and proven. All reasons glyphosate is the most widely used weed control product in the world today. That's a lot to cover in a minute. So if you still have questions, check out discover.monsanto.com.
Okay, now, as we have heard, we believe, according to the publicity, that it's really a good thing. However, as we're going to find out right now, that may not necessarily be the case, because as the narrator said, oh, it's great, we use it all over the world, and how it prevents weeds. And I am going into the detail of everything she said after I show you the other movie to get straight to the point about possible medical problems. Now again, this is possible, but it is narrated by a doctor. So you be the judge, and then we can discuss this later, because I have a lot of information. These are the only two little movies I'm showing you, and that should work. Let's see what happens here. Okay, there we go. That one leads me back, so, okay, I'll have to go back. Evidently, my little thing there didn't work as well, so let me see here. Okay. Now let's go back to glyphosate, because I had this one and there was a doctor, I thought I put it on there, and he was explaining how it worked. Let me try this. This will paste, and that should do it. There we go. Okay, but if glyphosate failed, then videos. Oh, all right. There you have one little glitch, but it will work right now. I had everything. There it is. Okay, that's the one. Okay, so here's the
Hi,
one.
everybody. Today, I'd like to talk about what is glyphosate. Glyphosate is Roundup. It's an herbicide that you get if you go to the home and garden places that you shop at and everything else. Millions of people use it on their lawns, and it's a chemical that was developed in the 1970s by Monsanto and has wreaked havoc on the environment and continues to wreak havoc. Basically, what Monsanto is doing is they're making genetically modified crops that are Roundup Ready or resistant to glyphosate. Glyphosate is a chelator, so it actually bonds to the minerals in the plant, which prevents them from growing, and it's an herbicide, it kills weeds, and it kills everything else. Well, what's happened is plants are becoming resistant to it, weeds. So farmers are using 2 to 3 times the amount to control weeds now. And glyphosate is a toxic chemical that gets into food, genetically modified food, and gets into people's bodies, which is another reason why you need to eat organic, always eat organic. So I took the liberty to pull up all the clinical studies and research that have been done on glyphosate, and I want to read some of these to you right now. There are 40 different studies that show glyphosate is completely linked to lymphoma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. 37 studies on
Zipbox presents Pure Chaos!
Sir, yes, sir. We're stationed on the floor, ready to...
Hi, everybody. Today, I'd like to talk about 8 times the amount to control weeds now. And glyphosate is a toxic chemical that gets into food, genetically modified food, and gets into people's bodies, which is another reason why you need to eat organic, always eat organic. So I took the liberty to pull up all the clinical studies and research that have been done on glyphosate, and I want to read some of these to you right now. There are 40 different studies that show glyphosate is completely linked to lymphoma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. 37 studies on DNA damage. 29 studies on the toxicity of glyphosate. 24 studies on hormonal disorders in children. 22 on low testosterone. 21 on pesticide toxicity. 20 studies on hairy leukoplakia. And the sad thing is, it's not even regulated. I mean, you would think with this toxic of a chemical, the FDA and the EPA and everything else would shut this thing down. 20 studies proving it causes lymphoma, prenatal chemical exposure, multiple myeloma, rhinitis, Parkinsonian disorders, neurotoxicity, endocrine diseases, liver cancer, chemical poisoning, low dopamine levels. No wonder so many people are on antidepressants. Infertility in males. Why are so many people having problems getting pregnant these days? It's not only the women, but it's the males too. Lipid peroxidation, mercury poisoning, pregnancy, environmental issues causing decreased pregnancy, substantia nigra, which is in the brain damage, botulism, chemically induced liver, meningitis, neurodegenerative diseases, oxidative stress, Parkinson's disease, vaccine-induced toxicity, breast cancer, all cancers, male reproductive development abnormalities, skin cancer, dysbiosis, kidney damage, lymphatic cancer. It's genotoxic, it's an endocrine disruptor, it's a carcinogen, it's cytotoxic, it's aquacidal, biocidal, hepatotoxic. I mean, this is a major chemical that we're being exposed to. So, join the Monsanto video revolt, go against Monsanto, call your congressman, anything you can do. I tell you what, stop buying Roundup. It's in the stores. Use natural herbicides if you want to use them. Get on an organic diet, please. Anyway, that's what glyphosate is, and that's how damaging glyphosate can be. Thank you.
Okay, now, that just gives you a little introduction. Now let's get back to the meat of the lecture today. So, I just wanted to tell you that, so, is it good or bad? Well, there's a lot of medical problems associated. So, what I'm going to do today, here is the outline of the lecture. I'm going to tell you what is glyphosate, the chemical structure, who uses glyphosate, the pounds used, categories of pesticides, because it's a pesticide, how pesticides work in general, specifically this one, categories of toxicity, Roundup Ready, safe. This is something you should be aware of. It says Roundup Ready. Why is that a problem? We'll explain. Health problems associated, like this man said, and alternatives to glyphosate, and then pesticide websites, okay? We're going to show you those, of which there are many. Now, what is glyphosate? Glyphosate is a broad spectrum systemic herbicide and crop desiccant. What that means is it kills a lot of different types of weeds. And systemic means it goes into the system of arteries. In other words, the they don't have arteries, but the veins, which are actually xylem and phloem, and it goes into the body of the plant, okay? And it kind of kills the weeds. So specifically, it's a green plant killer, and I'm going to show you later on. It only kills green plants because it only kills plants that photosynthesize, and its mechanism that I'm going to tell you about in a few minutes is that it prevents an enzyme from being produced, and that will kill the plant if you can't have that enzyme. In other words, the systemic herbicide goes into the vascular system. Now you have a vascular system called veins and arteries. Plants have something called a xylem and phloem, and if you can prevent that from working properly, then you have a problem. It's also a desiccant. A desiccant means it dries out crops. Cotton particularly. Before you pick cotton, you have to dry it out with certain groups of chemicals called desiccants. It comes from the French word desicar, I believe, and that means to dry. Anyway, glyphosate is used to kill weeds and grasses, although it is more effective on grasses. Okay, it was discovered by Monsanto, and there are a couple other companies that make it, all right? It also has many other names, which I will go into, and just real briefly, as I put here, it has an oral LD of LD50 of 5600, which means it is not really toxic when you look at acute toxicity. However, I will explain these numbers later on in the lecture. I'm just giving you a quick introduction. Then it has a dermal LD50, which means on the skin of above 5,000, and that means the numbers represent how many milligrams per kilogram body weight of the organism. And to put it what that means simply, if you're an elephant, a lot more of a chemical will kill you than an elephant because you obviously weigh less than an elephant. All right, this is what glyphosate looks like, and here are some of the products. Glyphosate is better known as Roundup, okay? There are many different types of formulations of Roundup, and here you see some of them, okay? And this is probably a multi-million-dollar business for the companies that make it. Here we have an interesting optimistic view where Roundup Ready grass with a question mark plus kids. What do kids do? They like to crawl around. Babies crawling on lawns doused with Monsanto's endocrine disrupting probable carcinogen, which means probably makes cancer, Roundup. Just so Scott, which is the company, can make more dollar signs, which of course is money. So again, what I'm going to do today, allow you to be the judge of this stuff, but I myself believe, and we're going to find out at the end, what can you use other than chemical pesticides, and I'll mention those later. Here we see another one. This is very optimistic. The ultimate killing machine. How is that? Roundup. Pretty cool, huh? So again, just because they make it out there and it's famous, it's probably, like I said, it's one of the most widely used pesticides in the world today. Does not necessarily mean that it's good. Now, who uses glyphosate? Well, we have farmers, industrial workers, professional turf managers, landscapes, agricultural field workers, gardeners, and groundskeepers. That probably includes golf courses, okay? And by the way, I want to point out something to you. The greenskeeper, he's the one in charge of maintaining the grasses and golf courses. Many of them suffer from brain cancer and other illnesses. Why? Well, it's obvious, because they're responsible for putting pesticides. So those of you who like golf, you can just play golf on a plain field. Now I myself, the only kind of golf I play is miniature golf. And I have a better time at it too. All right, anyway, So these are problems, and greenskeepers are in serious trouble, health-wise. Now, as for the amount of pounds produced, let me show you this picture. The color scheme here shows you where, what crops are being used, what crops glyphosate is being used on, and then this shows you the estimated number of pounds in millions of pounds. Remember, every 2,000 pounds equal 1 short ton. So you divide that number of millions by 2,000, it tells you how many tons. Corn is in yellow, soybeans is in green, and then you see others such as rice and alfalfa and other things, okay? So it's mainly used on soybeans and corn. Now, what do we know about soybeans and corn? Well, here, at least in the Midwest where we are now, they rotate their crops. One year they'll do corn, another one soybeans, back and forth, because that's a good way to prevent pests from multiplying like crazy, and they rotate the crops to prevent more pest development. Now, let's look at the categories of pesticides, okay? There are a number of categories of pesticides based on what they do, their chemical structure, and modes of action, okay? So, let's look at the categories. First, we have the chemical structure. We have a bunch. Generally, there are 5 general categories. Organophosphates, a good example of that is malathion. Organohalides, DDT. What does halide mean? That means either fluorine, chlorine, or bromine, or iodine. In fact, most of them contain chlorine, okay? DDT is the most famous, dichloro-diphenyl trichloroethane. And then we have organonitrogens such as triazine. That, by the way, is another herbicide which is used as a pesticide. Then we have an organic metallic. These are organic chemicals that contain heavy metals. And miscellaneous, such as rotenone, based on their structure. Rotenone is a fish killer. Now, it just so happened that there was a movie where rotenone was used to kill the creature in the movie. And any of you know it was called The Creature from the Black Lagoon. Look at a picture here. Someone described him as looking like a cross between a sardine, Donald Trump, and a bowl of matzo ball soup. Okay. Makes a very good description. All right. Now, I don't expect you to read these charts here, but this just shows you the various types of pesticides that exist. The one we're mainly interested here is a herbicide, because that's what glyphosate is. It kills weeds. Now notice we have a bunch of stuff. Some kill germs. A biopesticide kills living things from wherever. Disinfectant controls germs. Fungicides kill fungus. Insecticides kill insect, etc. Okay? Molluxicide gets rid of clams and snails and slugs and things like this. But the one we're concerned with is a herbicide. By the way, I once mentioned to somebody, you know, glyphosate is an herbicide. And I asked him, by the way, do you know what a herbicide is? He says, yeah, it's something that kills guys named Herb. All right, anyway, okay. So here we see some more. We have rodenticides. They kill mice and rodents and gophers. I myself like all animals. I don't want to kill them. Now, how do they work as a rule? Remember, I'm giving you whole information on pesticides in general, and then I will go specifically into the mechanism of glyphosate. And as we said in the beginning, is on the little flyer here that I use frequently, so it becomes a frequent flyer, just so I mention it. We're going to talk about the ugly and the bad. Okay, what it does is, the pesticides, they destroy, stupefy, repel, or inhibit feeding of organisms. 2, they destroy a plant, or they modify the physiology of a plant or pest, so as to alter its natural development. And this is what the way glyphosate works. We're going to talk about that. And then another type of pesticides attracts a pest for the purpose of destroying it and modifying the effect of an agricultural product. So these are what they do. Now, there is a lot involved here because we deal with the physiology of the organism as well, and it's not an easy task to get rid of pesticides, pests. get rid of pests. Now, here we see glyphosate. Glyphosate has many trade names to include Roundup, Aquanit, Credit, Glyphos, Rodeo, Roundup Pro-Dry, Roundup Ultra, Roundup WeatherMax, Protocol, and Protocol. The main company is Monsanto, but it's also made by Newfam and Dow Corporation. The category is an organophosphate. It specifically kills weeds. It's a herbicide. Now, anybody in my class will get an extra couple points if you memorize the name of this enzyme that it prevents. The name of the enzyme is 5-enolpyruvol schistosomate 3-phosphate synthase, better known as EPSP. How is that for a tongue twister? Okay. Anyway, there are many enzymes, and that's what that does. And without that enzyme, the plant cannot function. So that's how it kills the weeds. Now, there are two major types of weeds in agriculture: broadleaf and grasses. Okay? Glyphosate does a better job on grasses. All right. Now, as for toxicity, this is something real interesting because glyphosate, if you look at the toxicity chart, is not really that toxic. But the long-term effects are what we have to worry about. We have four general categories of toxicity, three general groups of toxicities. Okay? And notice, we have numbers here. And after the number, we have milligrams per kilogram body weight. The reason for that is obvious. If you are a small organism, you don't need as much of a chemical to kill you as that of an elephant, right? So that's why they go by the body weight. So this is very important. You have to go by weight of the organism. Obviously, if a little bit is going to kill a bacterium, it is not going to kill a giant elephant, right? Okay, so we measure the three main categories of toxicity as an oral, which means taken by mouth, inhalation means breathing it, and dermal means on the skin. Now, if you look here, you'll see the largest, the most poisonous one is 50 milligrams per kilogram body weight. 50 milligrams means 50 thousandths of a gram, which is very little. The second category goes up to 500 milligrams per kilogram, at least this is for oral, that means eating it. And then greater than 5,000 is considered really non-toxic, okay, which is over 5,000 milligrams per kilogram. And I want to point out that glyphosate falls into that category, okay? It's over 5,000 milligrams, and that means it's 5 grams. Every 1,000 milligrams is equal to 1 gram, okay? And those of you who take vitamin C can get it in various doses, up to 1 gram pills. They're pretty big, so a gram is really a lot, actually. Inhalation, you don't need a lot to kill you. Well, this is of toxicity. It's 0.2 milligrams per liter. And when you do inhalation studies, as well as aquatic studies, since you don't know exactly how much the organism is getting, you have to put it into the volume of the medium, whether it's water or air. So that means if it's a very deadly, it's less than 0.2 milligrams, which means 2/10 of 1/1000th of a gram, which is very small. And there are some chemicals I'm going to show you in a few minutes, which are quite toxic. And then, of course, we see the other categories. And then we have a dermal. Dermal means they put it on the skin, and they used to do that with rabbits to see how much of it will kill the organism. Again, you have to base it on body weight. And they also did something which is very nasty. There used to be a test called the Drey's eye test. And what they did was they used to put chemicals in rabbit eyes. They used to keep the rabbits in a stock, and then they would rinse it out every few minutes, and they will see what happens to the eye if it turns red or something like that. And again, if it's corrosive, you will get coronal opacity within 7 days. If it's moderately, it'll take longer than that, and then no activity within 7 days. It's not toxic, hardly. And then skin effects, same thing. Is it corrosive? because it causes irritation, or do you get very little irritation? Now, I have here a chart that I want to show you in particular because this divides up categories of various pesticides. Glyphosate is not on this chart, but it doesn't matter because the point of this chart is I want to show you one of the most toxic pesticides known, and that's aldicarb, which means 1 milligram per kilogram body weight is lethal. So that is bad, okay? You do not want that. And dermal is 20. So that's not good. But when you get up here to the bottom, notice on the top it goes from 1. In other words, the lower the number here, the more deadlier it is. The higher the number, the least deadly, because that means here you only need 1 milligram to kill you, where here you need something like 600 if you take it orally. You see that? So that means that that is not really too toxic because you're not really going to have that much. And here we see some natural ones called pyrethrins. And these have a dermal above 4,000 as well as an oral above 4,000. So that means over in this group they're not toxic at all. Even milk, I mean, you know, you drink a lot of milk, that'll kill you above, you know, whatever your body weight, 5 grams per kilogram weight or whatever. It's not toxic, okay? So, again, I want to point out, the lower this number, the more deadly it is and the more toxic, okay? Now, let me show you where glyphosate fits in. If you look at the arrow, if you notice here, I have a whole chart of various things relating to toxicity where they include citric acid, water. Water, by the way, we all know you like to drink water, is 90,000 milligrams per kilogram body weight, and that's the equivalent of 90 grams, see, per kilogram. So, you know, that evidently is not too toxic. And over here, glyphosate falls in the category of 5,600 5,600 milligrams per kilogram body weight, which means 5.6 grams, which means, in theory, it's not that toxic, right? But if we listen to what the doctor said at the beginning of the lecture, you will think otherwise. Now, here's the problem with glyphosate. You have to place it on GMO crops, okay? What does that mean? You have to put it on genetically modified crops. Here we have another problem. So, what does GMO crops mean? Well, if you notice here, there are certain crops called Roundup Ready. Here we have corn, soybeans, alfalfa, canola, that's where they make canola oil, and cotton. Okay, well, what's wrong with Roundup Ready crops? What's wrong with them is that you have to genetically modify them to withstand the Roundup. In other words, built into the seeds, genetically, they found out the gene to prevent the specific amino acid being made so they can't make a protein, and that's genetically made into the seed. Now, when you genetically modify seeds, you don't know what the outcome will be many years down the road. You understand what I'm driving at? Because as this sign says on the left, you're playing genetic roulette. This means, again, you do not know how safe these genetically modified organisms are for the simple reason that it's hard to test on a human. What they do is they test on animals such as rats and mice. The trouble with rats and mice, they give feeding studies, but a mice and a rat only have a 2-year lifespan, where humans have over 70. And you know, when you're dealing with a 2-year lifespan, that's not long enough to see results, right? You see, that's the problem. Now, they tried to extrapolate the results from mice and rats to humans, but I don't know if that's 100% accurate. So now, we've been involved with genetically modified organisms for the last 20 years or so, yet we don't know what the effect is going to be in 50 years. Or maybe it'll even affect your children, you see? That's the problem. So when we use something like Roundup Ready, again, which means it's specifically designed to be spread on these crops without killing the crops, you see? In other words, if you have a Roundup Ready crop and you put Roundup, nothing's going to happen, let's say, to the corn. But if you use regular corn, it might even kill the corn plant, you see? So that's the problem. And this is something that we may have to fight, okay? Eating genetically modified foods are not really safe. And at the end of my lecture, I'm actually going to show you the name of a movie that you can get on Netflix. It's not a documentary, it's like a thriller about a woman who has a son who keeps getting these rashes and keeps getting sick. And she finds out it has to do with the way they're genetically modifying the food, which is mainly cereals and things like this. Now, here we see the term Roundup Ready, okay? What do we mean by that? I'll show you here again. This has been genetically modified, and they use it in corned beef, sugar beets, alfalfa, etc. And here's just a chart about it, and it's quite bad. I wouldn't get it, although it is quite prevalent. And another term for these weeds are glyphosate-resistant weeds. And the heavy use of glyphosate on Roundup Ready crops, it may lead to the development of glyphosate-resistant weeds. So what does that mean? That means what? It's not going to work anymore. Do you see? So then, in order for it to work, you got to put more glyphosate and more glyphosate and more glyphosate. And this is one of the problems you have with pesticides in general. You can spray, and then some organisms get resistant for whatever reason, and then you have to add more and more and more and more to that. Now, here we see some negative advertising about glyphosate. Here we see this chart where it says the active ingredient in Roundup, which was patented in 2010, which was only 6 years ago, and it says no prescription required to kill your healthy gut flora with Roundup Ready GMOs. Now, what do we mean by flora? Okay, there are two terms we hear a lot associated together. We hear flora and fauna. Fauna means animal life. Flora, think of the word flowers, it means plant-like substances. Of course, you really don't have any plants in you, but the closest thing you have to plants are bacteria in your normal digestive system. You need those bacteria to help digest your food properly, but you may have problems with this. And this is what that movie is about, called Consumed, and I will show you the video cover of it in a minute. Anyway, let's look more now at some of these problems with GMOs. As we see here, how are GMO crops made? Well, what they do is they take like corn, which is the most popular one, then they take DNA, which is the genetic material. We found that out in my biology class. We take it from the middle of the cell, and then we manipulate it. We hook it up with DNA from E. coli, which are intestinal bacteria, with Roundup-resistant bacteria, and then they put it in the seeds. And what happens is you have a product. And then also we mix it with bacteria that cause tumors in plants, in other words, to break the cell wall. So it doesn't sound too appetizing, even how they make it. And if you read this sign, it says 88% of the corn grown in the U.S. as of 2012 probably has these genes in it, okay? As well as 75% of processed foods as of 2005. Now, I am a member of the American Academy of Environmental Medicine. They now are getting involved into eating GMO foods. And as you look here, this is from the headquarters, and again, I've been a member since 1989. This is an organization that deals with illnesses that most doctors can't treat because they didn't learn about it. People are susceptible to small amounts of chemicals in the environment, whether they gas off from carpets, or they could be in perfumes, lipstick, things like this, even in foods, which can make them sick. So here it says several animal studies indicate serious health risks associated with genetically modified food, including infertility, immune problems, accelerated aging, which means you age quicker, faulty insulin regulation, hence diabetes, either type 1 or type 2, and changes in major organs and the gastrointestinal system. the AAEM, which is American Association for Environmental Medicine, I'm sorry, American Academy of Environmental Medicine, which I am a proud member since 1989, says this. And most of the physicians there, many of them, they're called clinical ecologists. Now, what they're actually allergists, okay, that deal with these issues. And they advise the patients to avoid GM food. The trouble is, how do you avoid it when it's so prevalent? That's a big problem. If you go to a restaurant, I don't think the waiter knows, and that's a problem. You have to look on the labels. Now, here we see the cover of the video called Consume, which I suggest you go watch it. It details everything I've spoken about, and it's quite interesting. I saw it, and it's a thriller, but it's based on fact, okay? There are no shoot-em-ups in here, but it's pretty interesting. And it stars Danny Glover and a woman named Zoe Lister-Jones and some others. The one on the left, Danny Glover, he plays a farmer that's being ripped off by the company that makes the stuff. And then the woman, you see in the middle, it's her son that gets sick, and she's trying to find the root cause of this. It's a real good movie, and I would watch it. It's between reality and science fiction. It's really a good movie, and I suggest you watch it. Again, you see it for free on Netflix. Now, I have here some more information about effects of problems linked to Roundup, and they include quite a few, just what the doctor said in the beginning. I'll just go over them real quick, and there's the third one I just want to cover real quickly. Number 1 is attention deficit disorder, 2 is Alzheimer's disease, 3, anencephaly. What that means is you're born with a small brain, okay, or in some cases no brain, okay? Pesticides have been known to do this. If you're associated with pesticides or around them, your babies might be born without any brains, and that's a problem. It's a brain stem and something else, and some babies do survive, but you can imagine what kind of quality of life they have. And then we have birth defects, brain cancer, breast cancer, celiac disease. You heard of that? That's a disease where people have problems with digestion and they can't eat gluten. That's a common problem. And then you have chronic kidney disease, then you have colitis, depression, diabetes, heart disease. Hypothyroidism means you're not producing enough of thyroxine or the glands, thyroid glands. Then you have inflammatory bowel disease, also known as leaky gut syndrome, liver disease, and then one of the worst ones is Lou Gehrig disease. That's the common name, but the medical name is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. That's a disease that Stephen Hawking has, if you notice that. By the way, they believe Stephen Hawking survived it. In theory, normal people would have died years ago, but Stephen Hawking now is 72, and they say because of his intellect, that's probably what's keeping him alive. At least that's a theory. And then we have a few more: multiple sclerosis, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is worse than Hodgkin's disease, Parkinson's disease, pregnancy problems, including infertility, miscarriages, stillbirths, obesity, which means you weigh too much, reproductive problems, and respiratory illness. Now, so these are just some of the diseases or illnesses associated with glyphosate. Is it possible that you might need more than one thing to trigger these diseases? Yes, it could be a combination, but it appears that glyphosate is involved with many of them. Now, how do we use non-chemical ways of preventing pests, okay? I told you there are many types of pests. There are weeds, there are worms, there are insects, fungus, viruses, things like this. Well, I teach environmental science, and when we get to the section on soil and pesticides and hunger and things like this, we discuss various methods. The best method is biological control. That means using the natural enemy of the pest. Like if you find an insect or some other animal that eats that pest, that's the best way to go. But sometimes it backfires. And what does that mean? That means that you're going to get an increase of the organism that eats the pest. So you have another pest problem. But like I say, it's very difficult to keep everything in balance. But the best thing to do is find a natural organism which kills the pest. And they use bacteria, worms, snails even, in the case of something called calpera in the oceans. But anyway, a calpera, by the way, is an algae that grows. Then we have integrated pest management, abbreviated as IPM. They use three forms together. They use a little bit of chemical, they use cultural controls like harvesting crops at a certain time, and then using biological control. When you use these three together, you limit the amount of chemical pesticides. Now, there are a number of organizations associated with pesticides. It's the Pesticide Action Network, Pest World, and National Pesticide Information Center, which is, they have their websites. It's NPIC. Pest World is a very interesting website. It shows you hundreds of different types of pests. It tells you about them. And then we have the Pesticide Action Network that deals with these. So there are probably a lot more organizations which deal with that. And anyway, here are some of my articles cited. Now, are there any questions or comments about this? Because I want to show you a couple other things if you're interested. And let me just do this. I brought with me today a couple books about pesticides. And there we go. Okay. Just like everything, there are books written about it. I have here well, there's actually one book that has two parts to it. There was a fellow named George W. Ware. He wrote the first book called Pesticides, about pesticides, and the second edition, well, I'm sorry, this is actually the fourth and sixth edition. It's the Pesticide book and Pest Control. They're written by the same two authors. Well, this one's written by George W. Ware, and this other book is George W. Ware and David M. Whitaker. Okay? All right, so these are very good books on pest control. So there are a lot of books on it, but these are the best. These are what I use as a reference, and they're very good. They tell you everything about pesticides. They give you the trade names and other things, the insects they work on, how they work, different formulations, things like this. So, are there any questions? Nothing? Okay, well then, today I should say we have 100 people here. We have an interesting audience. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you around some other time. Now, since you two ladies are